always going to read it critically, and that includes students too. But and I felt like when I was reading your blog that I was reading a lot of my own ideas.
Oh, really?
Yes. Oh, yeah, definitely. And I was noticing that as I was mentioning before, I think that Stoicism is not just a Western philosophy; it's also an Eastern philosophy. I mean, one of my favorite texts is the Tao Te Ching, supposedly written by Lao Tzu, but and I've read it. I don't know, probably close to 100 times. I mean, I have some of it memorized, and but Taoism has a very strong Stoic component to it. I think the idea of being like water, and this idea of flowing with things, and also, if you look at Buddhism, there is a strong Stoic emphasis there too. But Buddhism partially comes from, I believe, Taoism.
That's right.
And I think it's important when we look at Western philosophy that we so often focus on 5th century Athens, but that we should also look at the Chinese and Indian philosophers that were way, way before that.
Yeah, I agree with that. I also like to look into those and find that common thread. I think the Tao made its way to Hinduism, and Hinduism made its way to Buddhism, and there's probably not much Buddhism and Stoicism, like directly, implicitly. They have a lot of commonality, but I don't know if there was any influence. But I don't know. One interesting thing that you mentioned earlier made me think. A lot of times, Stoicism nowadays gets. I feel like it doesn't get proper credit, because it's looked on like, oh yeah, back then we didn't know how anything in the world worked, so it's just easy to just say, well, that's out of my control. Now so they could only control themselves. I feel like that's a very ignorant and arrogant view, because there's no real evidence to suggest we're much more sophisticated now than we were 2,000 years ago. And it's still remarkably powerful to control yourself first before you try to control your environment.
Well, I definitely agree with that. And what I teach in my ethics classes, I talk a lot about Stoicism, and I explain to students, like, for instance, if I have a student that's going to go into, let's say, intensive infant care or something like that, I explain to them that you're going to have to adopt the Stoic attitude, because if you don't, emotionally, you're going to fall apart. And usually in occupations which involve life and death situations and pain and suffering, such as being a member of the fire department, police department, medical personnel, you eventually have to adopt a Stoic attitude, because otherwise you're going to be breaking down emotionally every single day, because what these people do is they face death all the time.
That's a remarkable point, because often the criticism of Stoicism is, well, it's anti-empathetic. Like, it's incompassionate. And, I feel like people say that don't practice it, because if you look from a macro zoom a little bit, all the most compassionate acts that ever happen by people that can control their reaction to their emotions, to take terrible risks and do terrible things.
Yes. And And I think that is the thing, is that a lot of times Stoics are basically, well, you're just emotionless. And you're like, no, emotions have their place, but at the same time, you can't get carried away by your emotions. In a lot of cognitive behavioral therapy, they talk about three types of mind. They talk about the logic mind, the emotion mind, and the wise mind. And this is kind of like a Venn diagram where you have a circle that's the logic mind, which intersects with this circle, which is the emotional mind. And the intersection in between is wise mind. Or if you look at the old Star Trek series, Spock is an example of the logic mind, right? Mm-hmm. Everything is based on logic and reasoning, and he tries to get rid of emotions entirely. Dr. McCoy, on the other hand, is the emotion mind, right? It's always, being emotional. Whereas Kirk is a combination of the two. He has the emotion and the logic, but he is wise.
I see that now, yeah. And it's kind of an oversight.
And
there's like an observer attitude to wise.
Yes.
Right? Is that what you mean?
Yes. Well, wise mind is that you recognize your emotions and you recognize where they're coming from, and you don't let the emotions carry you away. In Greek rhetoric and Roman rhetoric also, they talk about three types of appeals: ethos, logos, pathos. Ethos are appeals to credibility and to an audience's moral values. Logos are appeals to logic and reasoning and rational argumentation. And pathos are appeals to the emotions. And ideally, when you're trying to persuade someone, you use a blend of all three of those. But as you notice in your blog, nowadays what's happened is things have been totally taken over by pathos. They've been totally taken over by emotion. It's not about whether or not something is true or false. It's whether or not it makes you feel good or bad. And a lot of what I see in your blog is also you're talking about things such as the influence of social media on people now, and especially its destructive influence. And in one of my classes recently, I was presented with an interesting situation. I've only taught college and university classes since 1987 for the past 37 years. And I had a class recently, it was an ethics class, where I had 24 dual credit high school students in that class.
Whoa.
So in other words, they were physically present in that class. So we have students that are basically 17 or 18 years old. And I had 4 regular college students. And I had them read a book near the end of the semester by a man named Jaron Lanier called 10 Arguments for Getting Rid of Your Social Media Accounts Right Now.
Oh, man. 10 of them, huh?
Yes.
Yeah. Like, get rid of them completely.
Yes. And strangely enough, Lanier is usually referred to as the father of virtual reality. And he was one of the architects of Web 2.0. Okay. And he works for Microsoft. And he is basically, he knows all about technology, but at the same time, he is a critic of that technology.
That lends some credibility.
And he wrote this book, I believe, in 2017. So this was before all the states and everything are. I mean, if you look now, you've got the Kids Online Safety Act in Congress right now, and they're struggling about whether or not they want to pass it. But you have various states that have been suing social media companies because of what they say it's doing to children, and you know, all of this is, you know, it's you know. But he was talking about this a long time ago, the impact that social media was having.
And I think it's worth interjecting that that's how we seem to handle stuff now. It's like if we notice there's a problem, we want like regulators to handle it, or lawfare. We'll pass laws and try to prosecute it to handle it, and we like moderators and things. It all seems kind of strange from a Stoic perspective. It's instead of individuals deciding to regulate themselves on things and help convince their community how to handle things, it's like people are asking for authority.
Well,
do you notice that, or am I just imagining this?
No. A lot of times, we always talk about self-regulation and things like that, but when it comes to children now and social media, it's just that it is all over the place. It is ubiquitous. Yeah. It's like, for instance, the whole thing about, certain states now are banning cell phone use in schools, in K through 12 schools, and because they realize that cell phones are a distraction, because now a cell phone is basically a miniature computer.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's not just a phone. And I'm in a fairly strange position because I'm going to be 62 years old soon. And I grew up with computers from the very beginning. When desktops came out, I had access to those desktops and was using them. And
like a Gateway Windows 95?
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
I mean, back when you had floppy disk and all that, and back when what
Me
amazed
too.
me was how quickly typewriters disappeared once personal computers came out. And electric typewriters, they're gone within about 2 years.
Yeah. Well, you said that you grew up with computers, but I'm trying to place the timeline because, I'm 44, and we didn't have computers in high school.
Well, we didn't have computers. I mean, I saw my first computer my freshman year of college in 1981.
Okay.
But what we did have in high school, and when I was a freshman in high school, I still had a large, oversized slide rule because calculators were just first coming out. And,
oh, really?
And of course, with any technology, there was a question of, if we allow our students to use calculators, they'll no longer know how to add, subtract, divide, etc. Back in 1995, I was teaching English at Ball State University, and they made the decision that their freshman composition English courses were going to be fully paperless, done in computer classrooms. So I learned early on how to use computers in education, and now a lot of the classes that I teach are online. I don't particularly like online classes. I prefer face-to-face, but I realized it was the future. But strangely enough, even though I've grown up with computers and I've kept, ahead of all the stuff that's going on, I have not been ensnared by computers. So, for instance, people will never see me usually on my phone because I use my phone for two things: to text people, messages, and to actually call people. That's it.
Okay, yeah.
I don't use apps on my phone, and I don't have any. Only social media I have is a LinkedIn account, and I usually don't ever look at it.
Yeah, right. So this is intentional. Like you thought about this, you have a like, or is it just sort of how you came to prefer it?
It's intentional. I like talking with people face to face. I mean, I've seen the advantages of things like Facebook and getting in touch with old friend or Meta, getting in touch with old friends and all of those sorts of things. And I I use the computer for to keep up with news and all sorts of things like that, but I don't usually get involved in online conversations or anything. I will look at what other people have to say about particular topics, but I just don't have any need. And I never indicate that I like something or I don't like something. I don't usually click on things. Even on.
It's not surprising that you've taken the observer stance on there when you ever do get on there, because you're a humanitarian's liberal arts guy, philosopher by training, right?
Yes, but at the same time, I don't need to get my validation, I think, through social media.
Okay, so you think my proposition that has some weight, that it's the crowd, the consorting with the crowd and all of the things like that that's really harmful on there.
Yes, definitely. I mean,
Okay.
certainly we become very tribal now, and also there's this sense of anonymity also that the internet offers. You can say things and write things on the internet that you would never do in public.
He has that lack of accountability.
Yeah.
Definitely.
I'm not sure exactly why it is. It's like I'm not a Luddite. I mean, just last semester, I did several public presentations about generative AI. I know how it works. I keep up with these things, but at the same time...
Yeah, it's interesting. You seem to me to be very technologically savvy, considering, relatively speaking, and you're also quite a social person. I see you out and about often and talking to strangers and friends, and it's not like you seem like you'd be a perfect type to be on social media a lot. And it's interesting that you don't hardly at all.
No.
You find it extremely useful or valuable for your life to be that way.
Yeah. And I mean, and my students will tell you, I mean, a lot of teachers have problems with cell phones in the classroom. I mean, some of them, even college teachers, university teachers, when they see a cell phone, they just go nuts sometimes, and they take it personally. And I tell my students, I say, look, I said, I know that you use your cell phones for all sorts of different things. I know that the learning management system that we're using in this class, Canvas, has an app that goes on cell phones, and that students many times are looking up things on Canvas on their cell phones or on the internet, things that are pertinent to the class. So if I see someone using a cell phone, I'm not going to tell them not to do it. All I ask them is not to distract other people.
So don't listen to go through Snapchats on full volume or something.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Like you're in the movie theater.
Yeah. But I noticed right at the end of class, almost every student pulls out their cell phone, and almost immediately. And my cell phone is turned off, because normally you'll see students on campus, they're walking, and they have a cell phone in their hand and they're looking at the screen. I, on the other hand, am reading a book.
Right, yeah. So it's a different experience for sure. Well, let me ask you, if there wasn't a crowd, if there was not a crowd on your phone inside your pocket, do you think, because that's kind of how I view it, that's the problem. Because all of the other apps and things you can come up with seem to be powerful tools and things that don't really excite you, try to take over, try to like psyop your unconscious motivations. That's what I think's so dangerous about having that crowd, that mob in your phone, that fake, that avatar life that you have. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, it's not. At least for me, it's not so much the crowd. It's just that maybe because I was able to see things from a distance and see what was happening to other people. And when I would hear friends say like, "Oh, so and so unfriended me," and their disappointment and everything, and I just go, "What?" I just didn't understand, what the fuss was all about, really. And this idea of, well, I have 300 friends or whatever, and you're like, well, no, they're not really friends. They're
Yeah.
And I just like dealing with people on a one-on-one basis. I don't. I think maybe it comes down to maybe my background in rhetoric and composition, that I just don't trust writing, because I know that things can be misinterpreted so easily, and I just want the face-to-face communication if possible.
I agree with that. Well, I'm an English major. That's my biggest worry over the last few years is watching the quality of communication degrade among the public and the people. Conversations are almost non-existent. There's a lot of people talking at each other, but there's very little nuanced or effort to evolve your own positions or learn something new from someone. There's so much persuasion out there, and it's amazing that people seem to sign up for it. It's almost like they don't know what fallacies are or can't recognize persuasion, because I don't know, like if you're classically trained in that stuff, it's so transparent.
Yeah, and when it comes to persuasion, I always, whenever I teach people rhetorical techniques, I always have misgivings, because I know how easily these things could be used to manipulate people. And I'm very wary of things like advertising. I particularly don't like salespeople, because I just want to say to somebody, look, I know exactly what you're doing. I know exactly what techniques you're going to use.
Yeah, just give me the information.
Yeah.
Yeah. All you can do is actually talk me out of it.
Exactly.
I was going to buy it before you got in the way. It's true, but that stuff's important and it works. So what do? We live in a world where social media is a reality. Persuasion is a reality.
Yes, we do. And I'm not sure exactly what to do with it. I think some people voluntarily give up their social media accounts, or they only have one particular account rather than multiple accounts. And a lot of times this happens because they realize that it is taking away from their life in one way or another. It's making them miserable, and they realize that, but sometimes it takes a while. And especially now, what you have are kids that I believe it was maybe Heidegger who said basically, we're born into language. Okay? Well, now these kids are born into, a digital reality, so that this just becomes normal for them. This becomes, and I think maybe that's what they might question, or eventually begin to question and say, hey, is this necessarily good for me? Because what interested me when I used that book by Jaron Lanier was that I had a hard time getting my students to argue against what he was saying. They realized that the social media was bad for them, and that many of them were, in a sense, addicted to it. But at the same time, they weren't sure what to do about it.
I've noticed that in really young people, that there's almost a resentment. It's almost like they resent that they have to be on this thing for their social. And, we have these biological and psychological, I guess psychological is biological, drives to exist in a social circle and in a hierarchy of status and do all of these things. So you have these impulses that are impossible to overcome, especially as a young person. And it's such a weird thing that most of it's done in this avatar digital space. I think I could understand why they're resentful. Like, hey, why can't we all just get together like real people?
And I'm not sure exactly what the solution to it is. And now you throw in the generative AI, and I think that there is this sort of I want to say, my feelings about generative AI right now is I'm not that. Initially, I was kind of alarmed, but I'm not that impressed with it. I see it almost as a sort of a magic trick, in a way. Mm-hmm. And I also think that it's going to dumb down everything. The writing that I've seen from ChatGTP and Microsoft Copilot, it's middle of the road, It's it's easy to detect too, because basically it has no sense of humanity to it.
Yeah, well, sure. I experiment with AI a lot. I have a feeling it's going to be extremely prevalent, like it or not. Not just language trains models, but all kinds of other models.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I've told my students, look, you need to know how to use this, because all businesses are going to be using it in one way, one form or another.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I was telling somebody the other day, one of my friends is a coder. He was big into coding, and he refuses to adopt the idea that that's irrelevant now. Of course, I don't blame him. I'd be pissed too.
Oh yeah, I mean, people are getting laid off, and it's the tech people that are getting laid off.
But the irony of the situation is he busted my balls for so many years because I was an English major, and all of a sudden, English became the new code for writing code, and I was like, hey, I can write amazing prompts. Do you need my help for coding? He's like, fuck you. So is that the future of software design and coding is learning command of the language for language trained models?
Oh yeah, definitely. I was working on the big thing in colleges and universities now is micro credentials and badges and things like that. In other words, what you do is you create a 3-week course, and then people will take that course, and then they'll get a micro credential at the end. So for instance, and these are very skills-based courses, and immediately I was like, well, prompt engineering is going to be a big thing until the generative AI does their own prompts.
Yeah.
And what's happening now is that you've got all of these opportunities to be a prompt engineer and to basically train the generative AI. But what people don't realize is by doing this training what they're doing is they are digging their own graves, because the AI then will take over their particular jobs.
Yeah, the AI can already create the best. I prompt the AI to create better prompts than I can already. So, but there has to be that initial inspiration. Like they can create their own prompts, but the reality is my AI doesn't do anything until I tell it to do something. Like they have no biological motivation. They don't have. It actually does no motivation at all.
Right. I mean, all this AI requires millions of people training it. And also, I mean, the dirty little secret about AI is the sub-minimum wage workers in African countries and things like that, where their job was to go through and basically look at all sorts of different things like child pornography and all sorts of terribly psychologically disturbing things, so that they could edit that out, so they could delete that. Yes.
Wait, I don't understand. How so they had real people.
They had real people
reviewing the internet?
Yes.
To find stuff that's terrible for people to see?
Yes.
And then they would tell someone?
Yes.
To try to get it off the internet?
Yes.
This is nutty.
Because
what?
Because these large language models that are used by the generative AI, all they do is they scrape the internet and they take everything that they possibly can. That's why initially there's a whole series of copyright lawsuits that are in progress right now.
Oh, yeah, I've noticed. That's the biggest problem with AI. It will plagiarize like crazy. Obviously,
yes.
Everything it's saying is a plagiarism of some sort.
I mean, I showed my students last semester, I typed in generative AI into Wikipedia, and it came up with a 10-page article. But I showed them, I said, notice this 10-page article, it has 200 citations.
Yeah.
But
yeah, they have to cite the whole thing.
Yeah, but the generative AI itself, many times, it doesn't cite.
Well,
because it doesn't know exactly where things come from.
That's exactly what I actually meant by it. I would be happy if they decided, like, okay, I drew this from all these places, but it just pretends like it thought of it.
Right.
I'm like, that's weird because it sounds just like Jesus said that. But hey, maybe you're it. I don't know.
And yeah, and right now, basically, what generative AI is it's a prediction machine. I usually explain it to people like this. There's what's called the phenomenon of the long tail. So, for instance, let's say you're trying to determine what the average income is of a group of people, and you have 100 people, and 99 of those people make around, we'll say, $50,000 a year. But one of those people in your survey happens to be a multi-billionaire. Well, then the average income is going to go up greatly, but it's at the same time that one particular person is going to skew the average.
Right.
And so whenever you have, you're always going to have exceptions. You're always going to have black swans, right? Where most of scientific thought is based on induction, which basically means that in an inductive argument, if the premises are true, the conclusion is probably true, but not necessarily true. So you say something like, I have seen 1,000 swans in my lifetime. All of those swans were white, therefore all swans are white. Well, you can't really say all swans are white. You could say they are more than likely white.
Right, yeah.
Statistically speaking, because there could be a black swan. There could be an exception, which is why I tell my students, be very careful with universal statements, because all somebody has to do is find one counterexample.
That's a good point, yeah. Yeah, I usually try to say, closer to the truth. Like, absolute truths are really hard to come by.
Yes.
Or understand, I think. That reminds me of, I had your class. I was in your class early on when I just started at IU. And
what year was that?
99, 2000.
Okay.
So I had a couple of your classes, but you were one of the first I had. And I remember being impressed by two things in your class, and I want to ask you about these things. One of them, maybe you could think about it. There was a book that I read in your class that was about people losing or regaining senses they've never had. And, like, there was a blind person.
Yes.
Okay, so I'm going to ask you about that in a minute because it's becoming relevant again. It's fascinating. But the first thing was you had everybody in the class come pick an argument to make on a topic and come back the next class and make their argument. And I thought that's pretty normal. Here we go. And then, interestingly, everybody thought maybe they were going to get a chance to read their argument. They were all excited and attached to their ideas, of course. And then instead, what you did is you had everybody go back for the next class and write the opposing argument to their argument. Yes. And I just saw the gears break inside of people. Like, they were like, but no, I believe this one. And now, that was my first real experience with, like, Steelman, I guess, your own argument. Yeah. Which I carried with me all these years as one of the most valuable tools to evaluate my own thinking.
When you say Steelman or straw man?
Steelman. That's where you steal the other person's argument?
Oh.
So you trade arguments, I think?
Oh, yes.
Right, so but you can actually do that for your own argument.
Yes, you can.
And in fact, so powerful.
Yeah, and that at that time, that probably came from my rhetoric and composition background too, because I even though I'm a senior lecturer in philosophy now, I taught rhetoric and composition at the college level for 30 years.
Okay.
So I'm very familiar with that, and I always tell students that, it's easy to present one's own argument. What's difficult is dealing with the opposing arguments to your argument and having replies to those opposing arguments. And I've always made sure that I always know what other people are going to ask me or how they're going to argue against me, which sometimes puts you in a strange position because you're like, well, you already know what the weaknesses of your own argument are. And sometimes you're like, do I really believe this, or am I just arguing just for the sake of argument?
Yeah, or am I using choice supportive bias now that I just picked an argument? Now am I just going to defend it forever because I picked it?
Exactly. And that's why I don't usually have debates in my class, because I don't like the idea of debates because you have winners and losers. And I think the purpose of an argument is that even if you disagree with the conclusion of an argument, that you learn something from that argument. And too many times when people start reading something, they're not open to the argument. Immediately they start thinking of objections and counter-arguments and all of these things if they're opposed to the idea. Instead of seeing, okay, what common ground might we possibly have? What good points are made in this argument? what can I learn from this argument? So that whenever I read most anything that I read, I always get something out of it. And I try to remain as open-minded as I possibly can. And when I'm reading students' papers, or even if I agree with their argument, what I try to do is I try to put myself in the opposite position and see if I can come up with, objections or things that they haven't, dealt with in that argument. Even if I totally agree with what they're saying.
It's still useful.
Yes,
yeah.
it is useful. Sometimes they refer to it as being the devil's advocate, which comes from the notion of, and I believe in the Catholicism, when someone is told that someone is going to be considered for sainthood, the purpose of the devil's advocate is to go and find as much dirt as they possibly can on that person.
Okay. It sounds like modern U.S. politics.
Exactly. It's a vetting process, basically.
Oh, yeah. That's wild. There's so much debate happening. Everybody's debating everything, and I agree with you. I think conversations are so much better. I like finding useful criticisms of ideas that I hold, even if they're not directed at me. And by useful, I mean, they make a good point. It's well structured. It's something I can learn, and they're not, it's not just a persuasive or pejorative attack.
Right.
But I noticed as much as conversations are dwindling in our culture right now, also are useful criticisms. There's more and more criticisms than ever, but they seem to be becoming less useful or effective. We're kind of just bickering now.
Yeah, I've been trained as a critic, basically. When I was 19 years old, I wrote for my college newspaper, the Purdue Exponent.
Oh, cool.
I usually wrote about 3 articles a week, and I started doing critiques, and I started doing album critiques and movie critiques and things like that. And I continued, doing that. I have that type of mind, and I've always treated these critiques very seriously. So whenever whenever I've done critiques, I would usually do research also. And if it was like an album, I might listen to the previous albums from the same person, and I would also read published critics, especially for music. It would be Robert Christgau of the Village Voice, who is basically, I would consider to be one of the greatest rock critics living today. Not just rock, but just music critics living today. He's been doing this for about 50 years now.
Yeah. Seeing the whole spectrum.
And but at the same time, and I would say that I probably, in terms of writing, that the type of writing that I excel at would be the review type of writing.
Okay.
And that it's not just about showing the flaws in something, but it's also helping the reader understand how to approach that particular artifact, whatever it might be. A piece of music, a movie, a book, etc.
A good criticism. That's your intention is essentially to help somebody for something or improve their experience or ability. There's something positive that's supposed to come out of a good criticism.
Yes.
It's not a defeat.
Yes.
Yeah. And I feel like that idea is so powerful, but it gets lost now a lot.
And especially...
I could see you being very good at that.
In academia, it's very hard to find reviewers because academics tend to be extremely prickly, and there's so much, I guess what I would call intellectual one-upsmanship going on in academia, where I try to be as intellectually humble as possible. I consider that to be an academic virtue, that I know certain things that other people don't know, but they know things that I don't know, and that, and when it comes to things like, I love trivia, and I'm very good at it, but I told people, I'm like, it's just isolated facts and things like that. That's not knowledge. It's not wisdom. And it's stuff that you can look up on a computer now. But
it doesn't have the deep associations to meaning and such.
No. It's just I happen to have this mind that's able to memorize all sorts of different things.
I've seen this for myself. And all the things you're saying I really like about you. From early on in the university, there's a lot of professors that definitely walk around fully starched, fully stick-up assness, and you were just the coolest guy. But it was apparent from day one you were also one of the most competent that were there, and I appreciated that about you, that you didn't flaunt it around. And later over the years, I've seen you just cleaning house at trivia and doing some interesting things. And you have a pretty interesting, you also don't run the normal academic line. You've taught philosophy in prison for a long time. Or did you teach other things too?
What I did was must have been around 2005 or so. I was working for... I had worked for Ball State University from 1995 to 2000 and as a contract teacher in English, and mainly taught English composition and a little bit of literature. But then I was asked in 2005 if I wanted to be part of what they referred to as their prison college program, where you would actually go to a particular prison and teach classes. And I accepted, and I basically was teaching English classes in prison for 2 years. This would be like 4 classes a semester up at Miami Correctional Facility.
What's that like? Man.
Well, it was interesting because prisons are kind of like Native American reservations in a way. They're kind of out of sight, out of mind. A lot of people don't know, unless they have relatives or someone that they visited in prison, they don't know what prisons are like. They don't know what goes on inside of prisons. I didn't. And
I don't.
Before I got this job, I watched the first 3 seasons of Oz.
Okay, that was your research?
And I had a true crime background, so I had
That's
read
right.
about what happens in prisons and things like that. But
yeah, you're like a true crime wizard.
and the first day that I was teaching class, I was really freaking out. I was kind of scared. But then after a while, I realized, I was like, no, this is, Eventually, you'd see me, walking across the yard with a book in my hand, reading. I wasn't afraid that I was going to get shanked by anybody or...
Oh, you were in the yard during public people in there.
Oh, yeah.
Convicts.
Yeah. And I mean, when I'm teaching, I realized I was in a classroom with 24, guys.
Not enough people to help you.
And the guard was like 50 yards down the hall. And these guys all got pencils. So, they could do like a Julius Caesar on me easily. And
it's not funny, but it had to be. It had to be intimidating. I mean, they don't even need a pencil, really.
No, but but I realized very quickly. I was like, I was like, these are human beings, and if you treat them with respect, they'll treat you with respect.
Really?
And
All of them?
to a great extent, yes. There were a few that were initially a little bit scary, but I guess for me, when people are like, well, what was it like when you were in prison? Like, well, the thing that really bugged me the most was, I mean, first off, you're getting searched all the time. Whenever you go in, whenever you go out of any place, well, that's fine. I mean, it's like being at TSA. But the other thing is that you had to wait many times for doors to open. And that is not a normal thing. Think about it. How often in your lifetime do you come up to a door and have to wait for somebody to open it for you?
That's that. Is it that feeling of being trapped?
It's that feeling of being trapped, yes. And the first
you like gave up some of your rights to do this.
Yes. And then after I'd been teaching for 2 years, I became what's called a site manager. And MCF, Miami Correctional Facility, is probably the largest prison in Indiana. I believe they have about a 3,000 population.
Whoa.
And it's divided into two what are called phases, phase 1 and phase 2, and there's a gate in the very middle that separates the two. And as a site manager, I was basically, from my side of the prison, I was in charge of the college education program, various different facets like getting students admitted, getting them financial aid, registering them for classes, all the way up to graduation. And as a site manager, I was also working hand in hand with the DOC administration. And I was, this was a regular, and for me, it was kind of interesting because I wasn't used to necessarily regular 9 to 5 jobs. But this was a regular, actually, sometimes I'd have to stay over. And I basically, I was in every single part of the prison except for the guard towers. And I was dealing with prisoners every single day. I was not separated from them at all. And I got to appreciate what was going on. I don't think that, it's a very high-stress job, and I don't think people can last very long doing it. And I'm not sure how people can be guards and things like that.
It's tough to sign up to go to prison every day. Like a general principle, like it's not a highly attractive thing for most people, but it's extremely valuable, I think. The chance of reform with education has to be remarkably higher.
I could definitely see the changes in the students and their attitudes towards things. Now, they were getting a time cut for getting associates and bachelor's degrees. And this was a full-time operation. We had classes from Monday through Saturday from 8 in the morning until 10 at night.
Whoa. That's a big workload for a teacher, right?
Yeah. Well, we have multiple teachers, and they were coming from Ball State University, and I was also would teach classes too, and I taught classes in English and film and philosophy.
Wow, that's a wild story. It's an interesting background for anyone. Do you think it plays into your? So you had an interest in true crime before you did that?
Yes.
And how did that affect that interest for you?
Well, initially I was kind of fascinated by criminals, but when you spend time around them after a while, you get a little bit bored of it. And the other thing too is that guys in prison, the reason why they call them cons is because that's what they do. They con people. And we were always told, the main thing the prisoners are going to want you to do is to traffic for them, to bring them things from the outside world that they're not allowed to have. Mm. And the big thing in Indiana prisons is tobacco. And what'll happen is that these guys they're amateur psychologists. They know exactly what people are thinking, and if you give them enough ammunition, they're definitely going to use it. That's why I get a kick out of shows like Love during lockup or after lockup, where women fall in love with prisoners all the time. I mean, we had Ball State teachers that had affairs with prisoners. And these were people that had PhDs.
Still got tricked.
And they still got tricked.
Or it was genuine, but it's hard to say. Probably tricked.
Yeah. I mean, so I was always, I was on my guard, you know, and I was told, and this is true, that I said, somebody's going to con you. They're going to get something over on you. The main thing is, don't take it personally. And that happened. I didn't take it personally. But I think the big thing that I learned working in prison was to respect people and how important respect is. And I think that's and that's helped me in terms of philosophy, especially ethics. One of my favorite philosophers is Immanuel Kant, and especially Kantian ethics. And
that's one of mine too.
Kantian ethics is based on mutual respect.
Treat people as the end themselves and not the means to an end, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, that's such a powerful thing.
But and plus, I mean, my background itself, I mean, basically, when I was a teenager, I was a juvenile delinquent. I mean, I have no problem saying that.
I'm still a juvenile delinquent.
And
I'm just not a juvenile anymore.
And but because my father was a well-respected orthopedic surgeon.
Oh, that didn't go well.
He was, he was the co-founder of OrthoIndy.
Really?
Yes.
That's still big.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so I would get in trouble with the school and police and things like that, but he would get me out of it. You know, if I didn't have the father that I had, I would have probably been in prison.
Yeah.
So at the same time, I didn't think that I was better than these guys either, and I think that they could tell that.
Yeah, you don't ever seem to talk down to anyone, even if they're clearly in error, and I like that about you.
Yeah, well, I think that comes back to the intellectual humility or whatever and I don't see enough people in academia practicing that. And plus, I'm in a very strange position because I never finished my PhD. I finished like 30 graduate credit hours in philosophy, and I did my examinations and everything, but I never finished my PhD. So here I was with a master's degree amongst a bunch of people that have PhDs. But they've always accepted me as one of them, basically.
Well, that's good.
Because they realized that I took my job seriously and that I was an academic just like they were. It's just the research that I did goes into my teaching. rather than writing articles and books and things like that. And many of my colleagues will have me read papers they've written, articles they've written, or whatever, because they know that I will give it a careful, thorough reading and give them, good advice. But when it comes to criticism, I'm my own worst critic, by far.
Yeah, well, we all kind of are. Well, for one, you can't hide from yourself, so you can't get anything by. Yeah, unless you're trying to say you think you're too hard on yourself.
Probably at times, yes, I am too hard on myself, and especially as a teacher, many times, if I have students that are not doing well in class, I always feel that somehow it's my fault. But then I realize when I start thinking about it, I'm like, well, no. I've given them all the opportunities and all the tools they need, but there are so many factors now that you can't control outside the classroom. And more with the, enrollments are decreasing, and colleges and universities are becoming more competitive when it comes to students, and we're doing all sorts of things to help these students, to give them, like for instance at Indiana University Kokomo, students get free mental health services. There is a food pantry, a clothing pantry. There is a resource navigator, so that people are having trouble getting to campus, they can carpool or something like that. We try to do everything we possibly can.
It sounds like just removing barriers.
Yes, to remove those barriers so that the students can focus on learning.
Yeah. I like that. That's like improving the opportunity. It's not like some of the things I think are troublesome that try to control the outcome.
And when you were my student back in 2000 or so, I've learned a lot as a teacher since then as well. And I began to question a lot of things about the education system. Like, for instance, I tell my students the very first day of class, I say, look, I am not necessarily going to be like your other instructors, because I have particular beliefs about pedagogy that they might not have. And this is based upon my years of teaching and the research that I've done. But I usually in my classes, I don't give tests anymore. I don't believe in tests. If I have a quiz, it's usually going to be untimed, and it's going to be open book as well. And in terms of grades, there's this movement now called ungrading, and the idea is that you take away the pressure that grades can cause. And the way that I've done that is I have an open revision policy in all of my classes, so that if after an assignment has been scored, I give students the chance to revise, and they can revise as many times as they want to in order to increase their score. And I make sure that I don't talk about grades. I don't talk about what the grade breakdown was on anything, just to get rid of that pressure. And I think the students appreciate that. I always have to give a final grade in my classes, but and I don't offer extra credit either, because there's no reason to.
Right, with the revisions. That's interesting. So you take a more of like an encouraging approach rather than a pressure to perform.
Yes, especially my job is not to give the students information. All the information they need is on the internet.
Right, yeah, true.
But I am a learning facilitator, basically. I try to give them the tools that they need in order to be able to learn. And in a lot of my classes now, especially incoming freshman classes, I also will take some time out to talk about cognitive learning theory. In other words, how exactly do we learn?
That's interesting.
And I don't focus on things like memorization because the whole idea is that I also have an acting background.
Really? I didn't know that.
Yes. I've been acting since I was in elementary school, but when I got to college, shortly after I got married, around 1986 or so, I started acting in community plays. In high school, I had wanted to pursue acting, but my high school drama teacher said, "You'll never make it as a professional actor."
Really?
And so
what a shitty teacher.
I just, stopped doing it.
Damn it.
And then
who does that?
I got involved with this amateur community acting group in Lafayette called the Chancel Players, and I tried out for a role in the play Arthur Miller's The Crucible, and I got the lead, John Proctor.
Good.
And I realized, I was like, wow, there are all of these people out there who basically are amateur actors that have other jobs, such as high school English teachers, that could be professional actors, but, they've decided not to because, it's a tough job to have. But if you look around the area, all sorts of small, Kokomo, Tipton, Elwood, Carmel, Westfield, all of these small places have at least one acting group.
Yeah.
Sometimes multiple acting groups.
Yeah, I've enjoyed a lot of those things as a English major, and I kept doing it. The IRT, the South Bend.
And I did a lot of Shakespeare productions too. But one of the things that I realized though early on was, in terms of memorization, the hardest part for people is memorizing their lines. And the difference between amateur and professional actors is, if you're a professional actor and you go in for and you get picked for a play, on day one, your lines are supposed to be memorized.
I'm sure. Yeah, higher standard.
Yes.
Right.
Whereas with amateur actors, on the other hand, you're given a while to memorize your lines, or to get off what they call get off book.
Okay, because you also have a full-time job.
Yes, because you also have a full-time job,
right?
And you're not getting paid to do the acting either.
Oh yeah, that's another thing.
But what I realized was that if you understand something and it's meaningful to you, the memorization will take care of itself.
That's true.
So, for instance, especially this is true when it comes to Shakespearean plays, you can tell the people that understand what they're saying as opposed to the people who have just memorized the lines.
Yeah, and you probably don't convey the right kind of body language and posture if you don't deeply understand what it is that's happening in the story. I feel like this is going to play right into. I want to bring up that book again about perception, and you're talking about the players.
Oh yeah, the
conveying emotion properly if they really understand what they're saying. I feel like this is all going to come together somehow.
Yeah, the book that you're probably talking about is a book by the late psychiatrist, or I guess neuropsychologist, Oliver Sacks.
Yes, that sounds right.
And what Oliver Sacks did was he wrote a series of different books about people who had different types of usually he was dealing with neurological issues, usually brain issues. So, for instance, I believe that particular one that you're talking about came from a book of his that had several cases in it called An Anthropologist on Mars.
Yeah, that's it.
And it's called To See and Not to See. And it was made into a movie called At First Sight.
Oh, I didn't know that.
And it's basically about a man who was blind and who underwent a surgery that allowed him to see again.
That's right.
But at the same time, he was under the impression that, after the surgery, that he was just going to be able to see right away. But what he had to do was he had to learn to be able to see.
Yeah. And I remembered this book recently because of AI. And they're doing all these things, and they thought, the assumption was there's an objective world, and it's very simple. Just put a camera on it, and AI will be able to see the objective world,
Right.
and it will make sense the same way as it does to us. But as, of course, it turns out that that's not how seeing works at all.
No. You actually learn how to see. It's not something that is automatic necessarily. And, of course, he has the man in the book, I believe he is a massage therapist, and he has a girlfriend, and I might be getting this mixed up with a movie too, but I believe she's sighted, but she thinks that the way to experience what it is to be a blind person is like to put a blindfold on and then stumble around your house and knock into the furniture and everything, and it's like, nah, it's not like that. It's much different. And the way that he perceives the world is different than the way we perceive the world. And it's interesting when you start thinking about that. There's a philosopher named Thomas Nagel who has a very famous article called What Is It Like to Be a Bat? And he says that, it must be something to be like a bat in terms of how does a bat experience the world? Well, they don't experience the world the same way we do because they perceive things through echolocation,
Mm-hmm.
which is totally different than the way that we perceive the world. And, you look at other animals, like, for instance, I guess, raccoons. Raccoons are able to walk on creek bottoms, and they, with their feet, can determine the difference between what is a rock and what is a mussel.
Wow.
And so it was, and this book was all about, people who usually, many times, they might be involved. It has one where this man is a abstract expressionist painter and uses lots and lots of colors and things in his painting. He gets in a car accident and he loses his color vision. So now everything that he sees in the world is black and white, but it's not quite black and white. It's various shades of, and it totally changes the way that he perceives the world and how he emotionally feels about the world as well. Basically, he can only go out at night, and that when he sees certain things, like let's say a tomato on a hamburger, the tomato just looks ugly to him and
Yeah.
unappetizing.
It would, wouldn't it? Just this slimy gray slice of
Yeah. And there are actually several movies based on Oliver Sacks's work. Probably the most famous one is called Awakenings, which is about these people that seem to be in these catatonic states and are not perceiving anything, and you realize that they actually are. They just can't say anything about what they are perceiving.
That's always interesting to me, because now we're starting to talk about consciousness.
Yes.
Which is a very difficult word. It's one of the typical English things we do. We come up with a word that should really be like 10 words, because there's so many different things that are, one person thinks consciousness is the ability to think. But you can still be conscious and not think. So there's that. But then, and then you can understand consciousness in a lot of different ways that has nothing to do with thinking. Like Alan Watts. I don't know if you like Alan Watts or not, but
I've read some of Alan. Alan Watts was a popularizer of Buddhist philosophy during the 1960s. Yes, but I'm familiar with him.
Yeah, he talks about consciousness like you were earlier, that each living thing sort of has its own experience of consciousness, and to that each individual thing, all the other experiences that it doesn't understand completely seem strange to it. So the world revolves around their consciousness, and we're all sort of playing this game, and it's all very fascinating.
Yeah, there's been a lot of work recently about octopi and squids and other cephalopods and how they perceive the world and the intelligence that they have, which is actually different than human intelligence because it's not based necessarily in language.
That's fascinating to me. And there's a lot of people fascinated with octopi. It's an extremely old animal, very intelligent, yes, highly evolved, nothing at all like us, but ended up being very similar to us.
Yes.
That's all fascinating. How does that happen?
I don't know. And the idea of consciousness, though, there's in philosophy, they have a lot of what are referred to as thought experiments. And sometimes, because philosophers usually, especially ethical philosophers, cannot do actual experiments because they would probably be unethical. For example, in ethics, one of the most famous / infamous and probably overly done thought experiments is what's referred to as the trolley problem. If you've ever seen the movie or read the book, The Fault in Our Stars, they talk about the trolley problem, but they never explain what it actually is. And they actually do the trolley problem on the TV show The Good Place.
Really?
Yes.
I don't know this. What is this problem?
The idea of the trolley problem is that you are next to a lever, and there is a train on a track. And if that train keeps on going forward, it's going to run over 5 people. But if you pull that lever, it will switch the train onto another track where it will run over 1 person.
I see, yeah. I think I remember this.
So the question is
it murder both ways?
Do you pull the lever or not?
Yeah.
And most people would say, well, yes. 5 lives versus 1 life.
It's a utilitarian
It's a utilitarian argument. But then there are like all sorts of different...
If you take action, are you responsible for the outcome?
Permutations of the trolley problem. So, for instance, you have one where you're on a bridge next to a very obese person, and if you push the person off the bridge, they will block the trolley. And most people will say, well, no, I wouldn't push that person because that's an
Active aggression.
active aggression.
Yeah.
And now, of course, you can't really do the trolley problem in real life because it's not an ethical thing to do. But
True.
But if you
and you'd have to replicate it like 100 times.
But if you go to there's a site on the internet with MIT has a site called the Moral Machine, and basically it's that you have this automatic car and you have to decide, how to program it. And so it gives you variations on the trolley problem, where you've got like 5 people in the car, and there's a person in that's in front of you in the crosswalk. Now, if you keep on going forward, you're going to hit that person. But if you swerve, you're going to swerve into a concrete wall and kill all 5 people in the car. And so you have to make these decisions. And then they make it harder by saying, well, the person in the crosswalk is jaywalking.
Okay. So they're a lawbreaker.
Yes. And so they give you all sorts, and then you have a choice, like, for instance, you have 3 dogs in the car and 2 cats in the crosswalk, and you determine.
It becomes a psychological test.
Exactly.
At some point, yeah.
Exactly. Yes. Or because old people and young people, and
It's really a way to discover what someone's personal ethics or their hierarchy of ethics or values are, because there's lots of problems with the tests, of course.
Yes. But anyway, there's a thought experiment about Mary. And Mary is this neuropsychologist who grows up in this house separate from the rest of the world. And everything that she sees via a television screen. And Mary knows exactly what neurons are stimulated when you look at various different colors, like red, for instance. But she's never seen red before. She's never had the exact experience of red. So the question is whether or not this experience of seeing red is different than knowing everything about the physical things that occur. Mm-hmm. That there is and that's where the consciousness problem comes in, because
I agree.
is something it's like to experience red.
That's right. That's the fundamental. One way I like to hear that problem articulated is that it's basically consciousness arising from biology versus biology arising from consciousness, like fundamental theories, or that they're at the same time, they're inseparable, interpolable, interrelated, inseparable. The question is, can you have the experience without the thoughts? Can you have the thoughts without the experience?
Right.
And which one came first, or which one is reliant on the other?
Yes, and I think that's the big mystery. And that's like when people start... I don't like to use the term artificial intelligence. It was something that was coined back in the 1950s for the purposes of a conference. But so when people start talking about generative AI, and they're like, well, the computer now is intelligent. And I'm like, no, it's not intelligent. It's able to mirror certain things, but it's not really genuinely intelligent, because intelligence is more than that. It also has to do with recognizing that there is a world outside of one which one is interacting with. And I think that's the main problem with generative AI, is that it just doesn't have that world.
Yeah. When I think as deeply as I can in a reductionist way, I find out like all things sort of stem from experience and relationships. The broad definitions of those words.
Yes.
Like everything has something to do with experience or relationships. And of course, those two things have everything to do with each other. And AI is really missing both of those two things.
Yes.
And I think they're fundamental to what we do, to our consciousness, one way or another.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, definitely. I mean, and early on, I mean, computers were able to do chess and they were able to do checkers, and I guess now they've beat the premier Go master in the world. And
Yeah, I don't think AI is bad. I'm not making a criticism. I think it's amazing actually, and I use it, but I use it under those terms.
Oh yeah.
That I don't ask it for answers. I ask it to help me find answers. And it's amazing. Like to use as I don't trust its research, but I use it as like a research assistant.
Mm-hmm.
Like, hey, I have this idea. Tell me everything that's probably wrong with it and everything that's out there that's written to describe what's wrong with it. And to have that in an instant, to evolve my own idea that quickly, have access to that is incredible.
Oh yeah. And I think that in terms of education, that you're going to have AI tutors, and I think they're going to be very helpful because, young children are going to be able to say things like, "Well, I don't quite understand this. Can you give me another example, or work me through the problem step by step?" And I think that's what the AI is going to do. I don't think they're necessarily going to replace teachers or anything, but I think they're going to be a supplement. And I think that they can be helpful to that extent. I just think that basically people need to learn critical thinking. They need to learn how to be able to research things, to be able to evaluate, to be able to be critical readers, not just accept everything that is said, and realize that that things are much more complex than they seem. And I'm learning this right now. I've had the opportunity, because of the way that Indiana University has set up now. They have a separate track for their lecturers that's parallel to their tenure track professors. And most people don't realize this, but at the college and university level, there are 3 types of professors. There's an assistant professor, an associate professor, and what's just called a full professor or just professor. And that when you are first hired at a college or university, you are hired as an assistant professor. And you have 5 years. And at the end of the 5 years, you have to turn in a dossier and to determine whether or not you will be promoted to associate professor. When you become an associate professor, you receive what is referred to as tenure. And tenure means that you basically have a lifetime job. Unless your department is dissolved or you are fired because of moral turpitude.
Right. So you can't just get let go.
And then, after you've been an associate professor for a while, you can go up to be a full professor. And usually this is based upon the research that you basically have done. And your teaching and your service to the university. Well, recently, Indiana University has set it up so that they have lecturers that are non-tenure track, but at the same time, they're at different levels. So you start out as a lecturer, then you become a senior lecturer, And then the third stage is that you're a teaching professor.
Hmm.
Well, one of the perks that professors have, that associate professors have, is after they have been on the job for 7 years as an associate professor, they have a chance to go up for what is referred to as a sabbatical. And a sabbatical is either a semester-long leave of absence where you are paid not to teach and just to do your research project. And they're offering this to lecturers. And I this semester I'm actually on a sabbatical. And my purpose on this sabbatical is to reread Immanuel Kant's ethical writings, because I believe that they have been taught incorrectly. And that I myself have been teaching them incorrectly.
Really?
And I realized this, because I had been teaching them in a certain way, and I realized that that way is wrong. By going back to the original text and seeing what Kant actually says. Because too many times, instead of reading the original text, we read what other people have said about them.
Yeah.
And
that's a great anecdote to what's happening to everyone right now in our culture. Is everybody's learning, like, we have to go back to the source. You can't rely on what other people say. And there's this weird thing for a long time now. Nobody's been allowed to be wrong about anything.
Oh, no.
That's craziness.
That's the other thing, too, is that, and this is typical in colleges and universities, the professor that when they are asked a question, how often do you hear somebody say, I'm not sure what the answer is to that, but I will do some research and get back with you. To just say, I don't know.
Yeah, it's... Well,
because now
Socrates would like it if you just said you don't know.
We're expected to know everything about everything.
And have an opinion about it.
And have an opinion about everything.
It's such a weird thing. It makes it hard to learn. And you said you like the Tao. You like some Chinese. What was it? Oh, I'm going to get this wrong. I can't remember who said it. But it might have been Buddhist. I don't know. But anyway, you should talk. When you talk, you're only repeating what you already know. The only way you could learn anything is to listen.
Yes, definitely. I mean...
and you have to be allowed to be wrong.
Active listening is a very important skill for people to have, to actually open yourself up to what another person is saying. As one of my graduate teachers used to say, you let the ducks fly up in the air before you shoot them down.
That's a good one. Yeah, that's so true. So what is going on in universities, man? Because when I was there, it was great. I mean, it was really based, everybody was being trained in critical thinking no matter what field you were in. And the idea seemed to be that you could get exposed to all kinds of new ideas, and that you should not make so deep a judgments about them. Like, the idea when I was in college was that you shouldn't pledge allegiance to the first idea that sounds good. You're here to listen to lots of stuff.
Right.
And all the professors sort of were very much like that. But now, I haven't been in university a long time. I'm not an academic. And I hear a lot of stuff about what's going on in universities, and that there's, lots of policy changes and ideology stuff, and lots of suggestions that maybe people are being indoctrinated into things instead of... What do you see?
Well, I've been working full-time now at Indiana University, Kokomo, for about 12 years. And because IUK is a regional campus, it's a little bit different, I think, than places like Bloomington. Like, for instance, when when the um, when on October 7th, when Hamas invaded the Israeli settlements and killed all the people and everything, and then you had the troops gathered on the Israeli troops gathered on the border of Gaza, the Gaza Strip. I was teaching an ethics class, and I said to my students, I said, I feel that I have a moral duty to explain what's going on. And so I said to him, I said, Hamas did this. I said, this is an ongoing conflict. This is nothing new necessarily. I said, the Israeli troops are gathered on the border. I said, they're one of the best militaries in the world. I said, they're going to invade. There are around 2 million people in this 25-mile strip. I said, there's going to be lots of civilian casualties because Hamas, does not distinguish between them and civilians. I said, so there'll be lots of civilian casualties. I said, it's going to be very, very bad. And what I didn't realize was going to happen was that there were going to be all of these protests about it. And at IUK, we didn't have any protest. It wasn't like at IU Bloomington or, some of these other places. We didn't have tent cities.
Yeah, right.
And for some reason, I was very, very surprised. I never predicted that. I predicted exactly what was going to happen. And
there were protests, pro-Hamas protests.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, and not only that, but but I mean, when I first started teaching back in 1987, people were talking about the indoctrination at the universities. They were, you had a report that came out, Nation in Crisis or whatever, about the education system and higher education. And so this is nothing new necessarily. And the idea that there aren't enough conservative teachers and in the humanities, well, one of the reasons I think why there aren't as many conservative teachers in the humanities is just because you don't make a lot of money being a humanities professor or teacher. People don't do this for the money.
The interests just naturally don't align, is what you're saying. Yeah,
I think a lot of times, yes.
That seems incredibly reasonable.
And
I don't like the idea of trying to I don't like the idea of trying to control outcome anyway.
No, and one of the things I've always tried to be careful about in the classroom is I don't want students to know what my beliefs are on a particular thing. So, my students, usually if they come away from my class and you would ask them and say, well, is your teacher Christian? Is he this? Is he that? A lot of times they don't know.
Mm-hmm.
Because in a classroom, I'm going to bring in everything that I possibly can. Nobody's going to be able to accuse me of, and no student in my evaluations ever accused me of indoctrinating them or trying to get them to believe certain things. At the same time, I believe that there is a problem with what I refer to, what Deborah Tannen referred to in her self-titled book, her book, The Argument Culture, that everything becomes an argument and that there's always a side to another side to everything.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm like, no, this is just not true. Like, for instance, I believe that certain things are just morally wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And that there are no other sides. So, for instance, if you talk about, I hate the term, but if you talk about pedophilia, which actually means love of children, which is not love at all.
Right, it's a little more perverse than that.
Yes, I don't think that there's another side to pedophilia.
Right?
It's just wrong. And I usually, in my ethics class, I'll poll the class and I'll say, how many of you think that it is morally correct to throw a innocent baby into a vat of boiling water?
Yeah.
And my students, none of them will raise their hand.
Yeah, sure.
It's like, yes,
Yeah.
right? We agree on that.
I'm with you, man. I don't think that sides make any sense most of the time for two reasons. One reason nobody ever talks about is that two things can simultaneously be true. Depending on conditions. That's one idea. The other idea, the most primary thing that I see is the only people trying to draw sides are it's just a device for their persuasion.
Yes. And too many people have bought into this, that there's always another side to something, or, and you're like, yes, I think sometimes we have to take minority viewpoints into account, but at the same time, we can pretty much dismiss most of those viewpoints fairly easily by just doing some research. For example, during COVID, when people were decrying the use of wearing masks, and they were like, if you wear a mask, eventually, your oxygen will be cut off and you won't be able to, breathe as well. And I would think and go, my father is a surgeon. He's in the operating room wearing a mask like 6 hours. I've never heard of him.
He's never passed out.
Never passing out during the course of a surgery. So,
yeah. But then they did find out it was bad for children in development. But the whole point you're getting at, I think, is like, why? First of all, why aren't we just having this conversation amongst all of us? We have something new to learn, something new we don't understand. Why don't we all just start having this learning conversation? Why are we drawing sides right now?
Exactly.
Because neither one of us know.
Right.
So somebody's going to lose. There's no way to predict. It was dumb.
And, and then when people started talking about, well, there's microchips in the vaccines, I'm like, okay, it's just...
Yeah, well, once you decide to persuade everybody, you have to start making the story better. But yeah, earlier you were talking about that you can't say I don't know anymore. And during COVID, that struck me as crazy because I haven't watched the news for 20 years. I don't like advertising. I don't like television. I knew the mass media news was selling me something. So I just cut it all off. I haven't watched any of that for almost 2 decades. But I turned this stuff on during COVID because I'm like, I need to find out what the fuck is going on around here or out there, know? This isn't adding up to me. And, man, where was I going with this? Oh, shoot. Immediately, I was just completely blown away by, by people not admitting they don't know. I was immediately blown away by all of these experts that were getting up. And I had this expectation in my head. They're going to get up here and they're going to say, okay, something new. It's actually literally called the novel coronavirus, the new and interesting coronavirus. Right? So I expected all of them to be like, well, we have no idea what the hell, but here's what we're looking into, and we're setting up these ways to figure things out. They didn't say any of that. Everybody came out with answers. Like they've known forever. And I remember thinking, why are these people staking all of their credibility on something that they can't possibly know? That's terrifying, And sure enough, it played out that way. Like, of course they were wrong about a ton of stuff.
And not only that, but I think it's difficult to admit to other people that you were wrong. I've had situations like, for instance, going back to prison. One day I came into work and I was dealing with some issue outside of work. And I got upset at this one prisoner, and I displaced my anger on that prisoner because it was easy to do. And I realized almost immediately, I was like, that was not right for you to do that, Scott. And I apologized to the guy. I said, I apologize. I should not have talked to you that way. That was very disrespectful of me. You know, I was wrong. And I think it's difficult for people to do that, just to apologize about when they make not just factual mistakes, but when they, you know.
Yeah, that's definitely difficult. But before that, you wouldn't have to do that if you had just said, I don't know yet.
Exactly.
But why wouldn't they do that? Is it because they were under so much pressure in their position to give an answer, do you think? Well, I mean,
I'm not sure.
It still seems crazy to me.
I always tell my students, I was like...
Nobody said, I don't know.
I say, I know lots and lots of things. I said, but I don't have full knowledge yet, so...
Yeah, right. You could even take the long way, right?
Yeah. And I think it's also important for students to understand that they have experiences that I haven't had necessarily. And they know things that I don't necessarily know. So I can always learn from my students too, and I enjoy doing that. I mean, my purpose in a class is I want to learn along with my students.
That's a great perspective.
And I'll have students that'll, take me multiple times, and I'll ask them, I go, why are you taking me again? I said, I'm boring, I mean, I take someone else.
No, man, I think you're right. We should all be in a big conversation together, learning from each other, questioning our own thoughts more than others.
But I will say though, I mean, I think that students do have a problem when it comes to having those types of conversations. I think it's important in a classroom to create an atmosphere where people will talk to each other. Because I know now that there's lots of talk about social anxiety disorder, and especially after COVID, there's all sorts of, talk about that students are having all sorts of different issues psychologically,
really?
And yeah.
That's interesting.
And I think sometimes what they just need to do is learn how to talk to each other. And too many times now, what you see is that people don't participate in the art of conversation. They'll be at a restaurant, and they'll be on their cell phones.
Yeah. There's not a lot of conversation happening on cell phones. Even, ironically, that's what it was made for.
Exactly.
Yeah. I feel like we could do this forever, but that's over 2 hours. We probably ought to wrap it up there.
Okay.
I so appreciate you coming and doing this with me. It was a great conversation. Yeah, and out of the 1,000 other things I want to talk to you about, we'll have to save for another time.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks, Scott.
Well,
I appreciate
thank you very much, Dustin.
Yeah.